Oh, the day Africa stopped waiting. Chapter 1. Walk into Power. What happens when a 35-year-old African president walks into a room full of the world's most powerful leaders and refuses to play by their rulebook? Everyone expected Ibrahim Traore to be humble, grateful, even predictable. Instead, he showed up with boldness, a vision that could upend centuries of global power dynamics. This story doesn't begin in a village or on a battlefield. It starts in Riyadh, inside a marble palace of influence. Here, global billionaires sip espresso while shaping nations. They ride glass elevators, walk polished floors, and see themselves as the stewards of tomorrow. But one man's quiet defiance would crack that illusion. It was the 15th of March, at the King Abdulaziz Conference Center. Outside, Riyadh's skyline glittered, steel and glass soaring into the desert sky. Inside, delegates buzzed tech giants, oil barons, heads of state. Their mission, broker billion-dollar deals and forge alliances. At 9 a.m., the Crown Prince strode in a force of nature at 38, the architect of Neom and the proprietor of a trillion-dollar vision called Vision 2030. Today, he would shape who got priority with Saudi capital. But among those vying for a nod, few would challenge what he and the room took for granted. Until Ibrahim Traore stepped in. He didn't demand attention. He didn't arrive on a private jet. He stood quietly in his country's military uniform. No Armani, no Polity polish. Not a costume, but a declaration. Statement was the word on everyone's minds. Chapter 2. The Calm Center. The morning unfolded as expected. Glossy pitches, polished decks, leaders showcasing seminars on AI, renewables, smart cities. Each speech was crafted for applause, yet utterly forgettable. Then came lunch. Delegates clustered. LinkedIn scans hidden behind polite smiles. And Ibrahim Traore entered. At 35, he was younger than most, but his calm authority was unsettling. No one offered him a special invitation. No selfies, no introductions. Just quiet, purposeful arrival. He didn't seek to impress with words or with wardrobe. He refused to play game. Instead, he sent a message. He would stand as himself, plainly and powerfully. Chapter 3. Flip the script. At 3 p.m., the agenda read, Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso. A lower slot expected to produce mild applause, not headlines. But Traore emerged undeterred. No PowerPoint, no deck. Just the soft rustle of his jacket over that military uniform and eyes that seemed to pierce the room's detachment. Your Royal Highness, he began, locking eyes with the Crown Prince. Distinguished delegates, when you imagine the future, what do you see? He paused, turning the question outward. Skyscrapers? Faster tech? More profit? Then he shifted tone. Do you see people standing taller, walking prouder, dreaming bigger? Heads turned. Phones stopped scrolling. The room sharpened. Traore stepped closer. You've talked about markets, but near nothing about human potential. Rectangle and wrap sequences exchanged. Chapter 4. The Photograph and the Pivot. He reached into his jacket and pulled a photograph. Time froze. The first rows leaned in. A boy, 10 years old, sitting in darkness. This is Musa. 3 months ago, his village lacked power. At night, darkness ended the day. He paused. The air thickened. But 3 months ago, we funded solar ourselves, no charity, no loans. Musa said, now we can study after dark. Now we can build. Silence. Chapter 5. The Bold Ask. Traore stepped forward, directly toward the Crown Prince. Your vision for Saudi is bold, but I'm not asking for your wealth. He held the gaze. I'm asking for your place in history. He unveiled a map. The Trans-Sahel Corridor. 8,000 kilometers of roads, rail, power, and bandwidth. Designed by African hands. Cost, $800. Million less than one Saudi luxury mega resort. He said it plainly. If your kingdom joins us, it won't just build infrastructure, it will build legacy. Chapter 6. Silence, then shift. The room caught breath as he concluded. No applause, just stillness. Then, a ripple of understanding. Traore, shut the screens. I'm not begging. I'm offering partnership. We already have interest. Chinese developers, European banks, even U.S. firms. We won't wait. But I invite you to build with us." He stepped toward the Crown Prince. Eye to eye, two leaders from vastly different realities, yet speaking as equals. "Vision 2050, he whispered. "Not Vision 2030. He ended. Silence held. Chapter 7. Currents of a New Era. When President Ibrahim Traore stepped down from the stage, the silence in the room did not signal rejection. It marked a rare kind of reflection. Something had changed. The audience, composed of seasoned power brokers and heads of global industries, was momentarily stripped of pretense. Their polished schedules, their buzzwords and forecasts, all seemed slightly less important than they had been an hour ago. At first, the reaction was subtle. A slow turning of heads, eyes no longer darting to phones, but fixed toward the back of the hall where Traore exited. Then came the whispers not of doubt, but of curiosity. In a space where appearances often outweigh substance, here was a leader who had reversed the order. He spoke softly but struck deeply, and that resonated in a way that PowerPoint slides and billion-dollar charts never could. Some of the older attendees remained unmoved, their expressions blank, their postures rigid. These were men and women who had seen decades of summits, of passionate speeches, followed by quiet inaction. But even they couldn't ignore the undercurrent now running through the hall. Because while their faces remained composed, their minds were already recalculating. Others, particularly the younger generation of leaders and innovators in the room, felt something different, something stirring. These were not just policymakers, but problem solvers, entrepreneurs, climate thinkers, and educators who had come to Riyadh searching for inspiration. And now, in a man who had come with no entourage and no script, they had found it. Phones were raised not to text or email, but to capture. Traore's final moments on stage were being shared in real time across networks, not by journalists alone, but by the very people who had sat in that room. They weren't posting for likes. They were posting because they knew they had just witnessed the beginning of something historic. In the hallways just outside the main chamber, groups began to form. Delegates who had never spoken to each other before were now discussing what had just happened. What did it mean? Could this be more than a moment? Could it be a movement? A pair of educators from Tunisia found themselves in conversation with a Kenyan tech entrepreneur. All three had seen the same thing in Traore's words. A leader who didn't want sympathy or support, but collaboration. A diplomat from Brazil remarked to her colleague, "That wasn't a pitch. That was a philosophy." Others simply nodded, quietly absorbing what they had felt but couldn't yet explain. Back inside the auditorium, the agenda continued. Speakers took their turns, sharing the expected visions for digital transformation and green investment. But the energy was different now. The air wasn't as eager, the applause more subdued. It wasn't that the following presentations were weak, it was that they had been recontextualized. Everyone had heard a different kind of voice, one that didn't need amplification to be heard. In the VIP lounge, a Saudi energy consultant leaned over to a Qatari investor. "You know what's wild?" he whispered. He didn't ask for anything. Not really. He just told the truth. His friend replied, "Yeah." And it landed harder than any pitch I've ever seen. Across the city, those watching the conference via live stream were also beginning to sense it. Analysts on news panels used words like unexpected, authentic, and transformative. A well-known podcast host in London uploaded a reaction clip titled, "Africa Just Redefined, the Game and You Missed It." But perhaps the most meaningful reactions came not from the elite or the media, but from regular people. A young student in Accra posted, "I just watched a president speak like a builder, not a boss." In Lagos, a civil engineer tweeted, "I don't know what just happened, but I want to be part of it." Something intangible had moved through that room in Riyadh. It wasn't just the possibility of a new infrastructure corridor or another round of foreign investment. It was a different posture, a new tone that didn't wait for approval but invited cooperation. One that didn't ask to join the table, but to build a new one. For those paying close attention, this wasn't the story of a bold speech. It was the opening note in a new symphony. The kind where Africa was no longer defined by what it lacked, but by what it led. No raised fists, no angry declarations. Just a calm, commanding voice, calling the world to see beyond its assumptions. In the hours ahead, there would be deals announced, panels concluded, and headlines written. But for many, what they would remember most was the moment the room got quiet, not out of boredom, but because something real had finally been said. And as the doors of the conference hall closed behind President Ibrahim Traore, those currents of a new era, silent but strong, continued flowing outward. Not as waves crashing loudly, but as a tide that would not turn back. Chapter 8. The ripple becomes a wave. The room had been stunned into silence. But by the time Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman finished speaking, the silence had given way to something rarer: conviction. This wasn't just a diplomatic handshake or another line item in a development report. It was a tectonic shift, visible, undeniable, and already echoing far beyond Riyadh. Within minutes of the announcement, the news broke across every major outlet. $500 million Saudi investment in African infrastructure corridor read one headline. But those who had been in the room knew the money was the least remarkable part. Because what President Ibrahim Traore had done wasn't just secure funding, it was shatter a mold. For decades, African leaders had arrived at such conferences with carefully worded proposals, hoping to be heard, often settling for polite applause and modest commitments. Traore had flipped that script in a single afternoon, not by pleading, but by positioning. Not by asking for help, but by offering a future. And that, more than anything, is what changed everything. Chapter 9. The quiet conversations that changed the game. In the hours following the session, the main conference hall became a hive of quiet conversations. Delegates from Ghana, Senegal, Kenya, and Rwanda approached Traore, not with deference, but with purpose. How had he done it? What was the blueprint? Could their countries join? Was there still room in the first phase? A few feet away, American and European advisors whispered with increasing anxiety. The math was sobering. If Saudi Arabia was now backing Africa directly and seriously, what would happen to existing Western influence? Would French banks be locked out of new infrastructure bonds? Would American tech firms miss out on digital corridor contracts? Had China just been leapfrogged in a region it considered essential? And yet, for all their concerns, no one could deny the raw clarity of what had just taken place. A new kind of diplomacy had arrived. One that didn't wait for permission. One that wasn't scripted by Washington, Brussels, or Beijing. Chapter 10. The morning after. The next morning, as Riyadh's skyline shimmered under a rising desert sun, the Saudi royal court released a simple but powerful statement. Saudi Arabia believes in mutual prosperity through dignity-based partnership. The Trans-Sahel corridor represents a new chapter not just for Africa, but for the global South. It was the kind of language diplomats usually reserved for closed-door strategy memos. Now it was front-page material. Within 24 hours, investment firms in Lagos began re-evaluating their projections. In Nairobi, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs scheduled an emergency session. In Brasilia and Jakarta, economic advisors began exploring the possibility of similar models with West Africa. This wasn't just diplomacy anymore. It was momentum. It was movement. Chapter 11. Africa answers back. By the end of the week, the real shift was no longer coming from Riyadh. It was coming from Africa. In Dakar, the president of Senegal made a televised address, calling the Trans-Sahel Partnership the beginning of a new African century. He formally requested to connect the port of Dakar to the corridor's western axis, promising to streamline customs laws and mobilize domestic capital. In Ethiopia, engineers drafted proposals to extend the corridor through East Africa's tech zones, creating a pan-African digital highway. In South Africa, public commentators debated whether their nation, long seen as the continent's economic anchor, had been caught flat-footed. Even the African Union, often slow-moving and consensus-bound, issued a statement within 3 days. This is what 21st century cooperation looks like. Africans leading, partners respecting, and futures rising. And behind it all was the image of Ibrahim Traore, not waving from a palace balcony or dining with elites, but walking shoulder to shoulder with planners, engineers, and builders. The man who had walked into Riyadh alone now found himself at the center of a continental transformation. Chapter Shirar. Musa's Light. But back in Burkina Faso, the moment wasn't just celebrated in ministerial offices or boardrooms. It lived in smaller places, in dusty towns and rural schools. in the quiet pride of bus drivers and nurses who knew that something had shifted in how the world saw them. In the village of Garango, where electricity had only recently arrived, a boy named Musa sat under an LED lamp powered by a solar unit installed just weeks before. His school books open, his pencil moving fast. He had seen the picture, his picture, held up by the president on the global stage. He was no longer just a boy in a photo. He was a symbol. And more than that, he was a seed. Musa wasn't dreaming of escaping Africa. He was dreaming of building it. Chapter 13. The Critics and the Chorus. Of course, not everyone cheered. In Paris, the Foreign Ministry released a cautious statement about monitoring new developments in West African economic initiatives. In Washington, think tanks scrambled to assess the long-term strategic implications of the Riyadh alliance. Chinese commentators, while publicly diplomatic, warned that fragmentation of development partnerships could reduce efficiency, a coded critique of anyone not aligned with the Belt and Road. But for once, the concern of foreign powers wasn't the headline. The real story was the alignment unfolding among nations that had long been seen as recipients. Now, they were becoming authors of their own future. Chapter Quaters, a new blueprint. What Traore had delivered wasn't a miracle, it was a model. He had proven that diplomacy didn't have to be donor-driven, that African nations could walk into the room offering assets, markets, manpower, innovation, not just asking for mercy. That respect, once demanded, could be returned. More importantly, he showed that dignity isn't a political luxury. It's a strategic advantage. And across the global south, others were taking notes. Great. Let's continue with the next chapter of your story, picking up from chapter 14. I'll maintain the same storytelling, style, tone, and structure, and ensure the content is fully aligned with YouTube's policies. Here's ADS.com, Chapter 15. Foundations of Dust and Vision. In the dry heat of Ouagadougou, where the harmattan wind kicks up fine dust like whispers of forgotten empires, bulldozers rumbled to life. It was still early morning, the kind of pale dawn that makes the sky look undecided. Not yet blue nor gold, but the workers were already in position. There were no ceremonies, no brass bands, just the sound of shovels, boots, and belief. 3 weeks after the Riyadh announcement, the Trans-Sahel corridor had gone from dream to dust-breaking. In Burkina Faso's northeast province of Tapoa, crews in orange safety vests stood atop red earth, reading blueprints under shade trees while schoolchildren watched from a nearby hill. It was the first of dozens of construction zones stretching thousands of kilometers, an African artery taking shape 1 meter at a time. But what mattered most wasn't the machinery or the foreign partnerships. It was the decision Traore had made to start the first kilometer at home. Not in Dakar, not in a port city, not in the capital's business district. No, the first stretch would begin in one of the poorest regions of the continent on purpose. Traore called it building from the roots. If the most forgotten child can see the road begin at their feet, he said to reporters, they'll never again believe they are forgotten. It wasn't just poetic, it was strategic. Because this corridor wasn't just about connecting economies, it was about stitching dignity back into the land. A president in boots, instead of retreating to high offices, President Traore began making unannounced visits to construction sites. He traveled not with entourages, but with engineers and translators. He would walk stretches of cleared land beside local surveyors, taking notes and asking simple questions. How many people from this village are on the payroll? Are we sourcing stone locally? Where will the water runoff go during rainy season? To foreign eyes, it seemed humble, even odd. But for the thousands watching the news in Bambara, Moor, Fulfulde, and dozens of local languages, it meant something far deeper. This was their road. Their future wasn't being outsourced. In one now famous clip that aired across Francophone Africa, Traore is seen squatting beside a boy holding a plastic lunchbox. "What do you want to be?" he asks. The boy replies, "A driver on this road." Traore nods. "Then we better build it strong enough for you." The architects of renewal. Meanwhile, behind the scenes in Ouagadougou, a different kind of machinery was in motion. A team of 70 African urban planners, civil engineers, and software developers convened in a repurposed government hall once used for colonial tax filings, now reimagined as the African Design Studio. Here, maps sprawled across tables like treasure scrolls. On chalkboards, someone had written in bold block letters, "We are not copying Shanghai. We are creating Sankara." It was more than a quote. It was a mantra. From Lagos to Nairobi, architects sent in modular design concepts. In Abidjan, data scientists began testing AI models to optimize bus routes once the corridor connected. In Ghana, solar innovators proposed panel installations using recycled plastics from coastal cleanups. Even tech hubs in Kigali started adapting blockchain tools to ensure procurement transparency across the project. This wasn't a single country effort. It was a multi-nation movement. And for the first time in decades, many African professionals felt like their talents weren't just being exported, they were being honored. The mothers who fed the road. In the town of Fada Ngurma, halfway between Ouagadougou and the Niger border, a group of women, mostly in their 50s and 60s, formed a cooperative kitchen under a thatched canopy. Their goal was simple: feed the workers. But their impact was extraordinary. Using traditional recipes and ingredients sourced from local markets, they created rotating menus that fed up to 400 laborers daily. Stews of millet and baobab leaf, groundnut sauces thickened with smoked fish, tamarind juices served with calabash ladles. Soon, they weren't just feeding, they were employing. Teenage girls started learning the recipes. Farmers negotiated better prices as demand grew. A local seamstress even got a contract to make aprons and headscarves bearing the logo, Mothers of the Corridor. The road wasn't just passing through their town, it was transforming it. The returnees. From Europe and the Gulf, the return began not of tourists or NGOs, but of African talent. Hamadou, a 29-year-old electrical engineer who had worked in Dubai skyscrapers, came back to Burkina Faso to lead a 40-person solar grid project along the corridor. Mariama, a logistics analyst who had lived in Lyon for 6 years, left her job in supply chain management to organize rail cargo routes from the Sahel to coastal ports. They weren't alone. Within 2 months, Burkina Faso recorded the highest number of skilled worker return applications in 15 years. The Ministry of Labor launched an online portal called Come Build Home, offering mentorships, language reintegration help, and housing subsidies. The diaspora wasn't just welcome, they were essential. The Global South, rewritten. As this momentum built, something unusual began happening in capitals far from West Africa. In Brasilia, a delegation from the Brazilian Development Bank scheduled a meeting in Accra, not Paris, to explore South-South infrastructure financing. In New Delhi, India's railway experts requested technical consultations with Niger and Burkina Faso on desert rail integration. In Jakarta, Indonesia's president openly praised the Trans-Sahel model, calling it a roadmap for the Global South to define its own century. Even Australia, long focused on its Pacific neighborhood, expressed interest in trade routes that would one day connect its lithium to African EV battery plants. A new vocabulary began circulating not in government white papers, but in student movements, innovation forums, and local media. Words like mutual dignity, post, aid, cooperation, infrastructure sovereignty. The continent wasn't demanding change. It was enacting it. The opposition wavers. Of course, the old guard did not vanish quietly. Some European analysts dismissed the corridor as symbolic. It's another oversized ribbon-cutting project. A Paris pundit scoffed on live television. Africa always builds roads, then forgets to maintain them. But that week, a fact-check article showed that Burkina Faso's new maintenance contracts included community-based infrastructure stewards paid, trained, and empowered to monitor conditions via smartphone apps co-developed with Rwandan coders. Elsewhere, a Western columnist warned about debt traps with new financing. But when a Wall Street Journal investigative piece revealed that the Riyadh investment included a 20-year grace period and co-ownership of corridor revenue streams, public opinion shifted. The deal was not aid, it was equity. And equity changed everything. The dreamers with shovels. Back at the Tapoa construction site, the work pressed on. But something curious had begun happening each afternoon. Around 5:30 p.m., children would gather at the site's edge, watching the bulldozers park and the crews wind down. Then, they'd step onto the red earth, carrying sticks and chalk. They'd draw pretend lanes. They'd build tiny bridges with pebbles. They'd organize imaginary traffic. One evening, A reporter asked a boy what he was doing. "I'm building the road," he said simply. "But the road's already being built," she said. The boy shook his head. "Not this one," he said. "Mine goes to the future." Chapter 16. The School Beneath the Baobab. It began, as so many things did in Burkina Faso, under a tree. Not just any tree, but an enormous baobab whose branches twisted like ancient calligraphy against the Sahel sky. In the village of Gorcy, where goats meandered freely between clay houses and laughter carried easily on the breeze, the baobab had always been a symbol, a place where elders told stories, where disputes were resolved, where boys once gathered to play with marbles made of hardened mud. But in the summer of that year, it became something else. It became a school, not the kind with chalkboards or plastic chairs, the kind with hammers, wires, solar panels, and long afternoons of mistakes. The villagers called it El Col de Future, the School of the Future. It had no official charter, no ministry stamp, but it had something more powerful: relevance. And relevance, as it turned out, was the most radical curriculum of all. A different kind of classroom. It started when a mechanic named Soleiman returned from Bamako with a truckload of broken electronics, old satellite dishes, cracked phone screens, frayed extension cords. He dumped it beneath the baobab and told the teenagers who had once been labeled dropouts to take it apart. "What are we supposed to do?" one of them asked. "Figure out what works," he replied. They did. Over the next weeks, they discovered resistors. They learned to solder. One girl rebuilt a radio. Another repaired a battery charger and used it to electrify her grandmother's hut. Soon, Suleiman brought a few solar panels left over from an NGO project. Then came toolboxes. Then visitors from neighboring villages. Then funding from a cooperative in Bobo Dioulasso. By mid-year, the informal school had expanded from a single tree to a 5-shelter campus, each dedicated to a field: energy, construction, code, language, and logistics. The school ran on what they called the 3 R's: repair, reimagine, reconnect. They didn't aim to mimic Western models. They aimed to solve local problems using local wisdom and global tools, learning to build roads, not just drive them. By the time the Trans-Sahel corridor entered its 3rd phase, one thing had become clear: there weren't enough trained workers to sustain the pace of construction. Burkina Faso's Ministry of Public Works issued a statement asking vocational institutions to prepare 20,000 skilled workers in 2 years, an almost impossible task. But Gorcy didn't wait for permission. They opened an accelerator path, allowing anyone who completed 100 hours of hands-on training at the School of the Future to qualify for a corridor work crew. The curriculum included more than technical skills. It included ethics, teamwork, and even dialect navigation, because the corridor crossed regions where French, Hausa, Fulani, and dozens of tongues intertwined. By year's end, Gorcy had produced 400 certified apprentices, many of them young women who had never previously considered engineering. One of them, a 19-year-old named Hassana, became a site supervisor near the Mali border. When asked what she wanted next, she replied, "To build a school like this in every village with a baobab." The Convergence Summit. While local innovation bloomed from below, something unprecedented was unfolding at the top. In Nairobi, a summit was called not by the United Nations or the African Union, but by a coalition of 8 Sahelian and coastal nations participating in the corridor. The invitation simply read, "Let us plan together what others planned for us alone." The summit drew ministers, mayors, youth delegates, agricultural scientists, fintech innovators, and elders from all over Africa. They called it the Convergence Summit, a word chosen carefully to mean more than meeting. It meant coming together after divergence. Traore arrived quietly, dressed in a plain indigo tunic and sandals. He avoided the dais and instead sat among the youth delegates. When someone asked why he didn't speak during the opening session, he smiled. "I came here to listen." That became a theme of the week. Because for too long, African forums had mimicked their colonial architects' high speeches, little action. This one was different. Instead of declarations, they produced roadmaps. Instead of slogans, they wrote open-source software. Instead of competing, they harmonized trade rules, electricity grids, academic credits, even customs checkpoints. By the summit's close, a new body had emerged. The Council for Corridor Integration, part network, part think tank, part watchdog. Its motto was, "We don't coordinate with the world to beg. We coordinate with each other to lead." The day France called. 1 week after the Convergence Summit, a call came into the Foreign Ministry in Ouagadougou. It was Paris, not to reprimand, not to warn, but to propose. The French Minister of Foreign Affairs requested a bilateral meeting with the leaders of Burkina Faso and Mali, not as former colonies, but as equal trade partners. The proposal? A joint research initiative to study desert agriculture and export new irrigation methods to drought-hit southern Europe. It stunned the political class. For over a century, the dynamic had flowed one way. Paris dictated, Africa adjusted. But now, French farmers were asking African scientists for guidance. Now, the streets of Montpellier were hosting food markets with fonio and moringa. Now, the dignity was mutual. Traore accepted the meeting, not in a palace, but in a library. They sat in a circular room filled with books by African authors, and Traore opened with a line that would be quoted across continents. "We don't ask you to forget history, only to help us write what comes next." Voices from the road. By this time, a new wave of journalism had begun documenting the corridor from the ground. Not foreign correspondents with satellite vans, but African storytellers with smartphones, podcasts, and drones. They followed truck drivers across the plains. They recorded oral histories from elders who had never left their villages. They live-streamed markets, springing up beside new rest stops. One of the most popular channels was Voices from the Road, run by a group of Birkenab High School graduates who traveled in a used minibus, trading meals for interviews and music for fuel. Their videos weren't polished, but they were powerful. In one episode, they interviewed a widow who sold hand-woven mats near a toll station. She explained that for the first time in her life, trucks were stopping in her town, and her sons no longer had to migrate to Libya for work. In another, they followed a young man named Ilyas as he opened a tire repair shop in what used to be a no-man's land between borders. The road didn't just bring traffic, he said, it brought tomorrow. From isolation to interdependence. For decades, the Central Sahel had been seen by outsiders as a zone of instability defined by headlines about violence, drought, and poverty. But something profound was happening beneath those old narratives. Schools were being built not to chase diplomas, but to chase relevance. Cooperatives were outbidding foreign suppliers because they understood the terrain. Women were becoming logistics coordinators. Elders were becoming data archivists. Children were imagining not escape, but contribution. In a single year, inter-African trade increased by 23%. Cross-border marriage applications rose. Joint patents were filed. And in one symbolic moment, 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Niger, signed a mutual recognition pact for vocational certifications, allowing workers to move freely along the corridor with dignity. It wasn't just a road anymore. It was a reality shift. The boy and the blueprint. Back in Gorcy, as the School of the Future wrapped its day under the baobab, Suleiman gathered his students for a new challenge, designing a rainproof shelter for electronics training. He passed out graph paper and pencils. Among the students was the same boy who had once drawn imaginary traffic lanes with a stick in the dirt. This time, he drew a structure shaped like a bird's wing, with sloped solar panels and retractable sidewalls. He explained that when the rainy season came, the water would drain into a small tank used for cooling. Suleiman studied the sketch for a moment, then smiled. "What do you call this design?" The boy looked up. "I call it freedom that doesn't leak." Bidel,